Why are the pyramids still in Egypt? Because they are too big to steal. It's a well-known joke, and it sets the tone for today's discussion, which is, of course, not a joking matter. We're looking at museums. Are they places of history and culture, or the trophy rooms of empire? I'm Stefanie Dekker, and welcome to the stream.
We're opening the Grand Egyptian Museum.
This half in Egypt, and this half in the British Museum.
If you look to your left, you'll see Egyptian antiques, and to your right, Nigerian artifacts. And if you follow me down the hall, our 14th century Ghanaian scriptures.
Finding things the British Museum has stolen from all of our countries.
Much of it has been built on stolen African heritage.
China has demanded that the British Museum return all of its Chinese cultural relics.
Germany is returning over 1,000 stolen Nigerian artifacts.
$100 million Louvre heist wasn't a robbery, it was a reclamation.
I don't understand. I don't understand.
The Grand Egyptian Museum, the largest archaeological museum on Earth, has finally opened its doors. But here's the irony. Many of its famous treasures aren't even in that building. They remain thousands of miles away in museums across London, Paris, Berlin, and more. Now, such museums are being pushed to confront the origins of their collections, formed during colonial times. So, are we seeing the beginnings of a shift to decolonize museums, and who gets to decide what belongs where? Well, to discuss all of this, we are joined by Kotoz Ahmed. He's an Egyptian historian and specialist in the study of cultural heritage in the digital age and a postdoctoral researcher at Ghent University. And we have Shaheen Kasmani, an artist, creative producer, curator, and educator with a master's in visual, traditional, and Islamic arts. Thank you so much for joining us on the stream today. Shaheen, I am going to start with you with a very direct question. What is wrong with museums?
Well, I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with museums, but what is wrong with them is quite a lot, unfortunately. Like, firstly, they are designed as colonial institutions in the sense that they really do house all the colonial loot of empire. I'm in London, I'm in the UK, and any museum you can walk in and just see so many things from around the world, which were stolen, and then also the complete unacknowledgement of that provenance, of that story of how the object ended up here in London instead of being in India or in Nigeria or in Greece or, wherever it was from. So yeah, there's quite a lot. There's the objects themselves that, have a very problematic journey of getting here. And then it's the narrative around them as well. Like, a lot of museums claim to be neutral spaces, claim to be in that sort of neutral standpoint, but can a museum actually be neutral? It uses the passive voice in all its descriptions, and it's a way of, I think they see themselves as these kind of benchmarks or yardsticks of culture and heritage and history, but actually, purposefully delete, as it were, so much of it.
I want to pick on something you said there, Kotoz, and put that to you. Can museums be neutral spaces?
Absolutely not. So basically, you need to think of museums as narratives, and due to the huge cost and the huge effort that is involved in erecting a museum, in collecting a collection, in displaying that, it's not something that can easily be done by unbiased, or rather than unbiased, like uninterested actors, right? So by thinking of it as a narrative, it can never be neutral in that way. So I think what we should be asking is, what is the story being told by each museum, and how does that relate to the context in which this museum emerged, and also to the connections that bring it to the rest of the world? Because a museum is also, in a sense, a product of a certain idea that emerged in the late Renaissance and the early modernity, of bringing the world together in one place and putting it in a display case for us to see. So here we need to ask the question, who are us? Does that include humanity in general, or does it include a certain subgroup? And also, how do we see the world and how we display it in this display case? So accordingly, no, it can never be a neutral space.
Now, as Kotoz was saying there, museums cannot be decolonized. Well, many people agree.
The title is Can the Western Museum Ever Be Decolonized? And to that question, François Vergès replies no, that the Western Museum cannot be decolonized. And the only true act of decolonization, according to François Vergès, is to think of the post-museum. So she spends the first half of the book explaining how she situates the crime of the Western Museum not in the fact that they exhibit artifacts that are looted. She explains that the crime of the Western Museum is in its very birth because it was born out of the 18th century Euro Enlightenment period, where they believed that Europe was the only place in the world that could exhibit all of humanity and humanity's history. And it was born as a colonial enterprise. It was born to justify colonial expansion, colonial crimes, dispossession, and exploitation.
Shaheen, I saw you nodding. Is the concept of decolonization of museums, is it as simple as just giving everything back, or is it more complex than that?
I mean, I think giving everything back is the first thing, because that's what decolonization actually means. You know, it means giving land back, in this case, giving objects and resources back. So in the first sense, that's what that means. But of course, there's more to it in the sense that when will museums tell the truth about the objects? You know, if they're giving them back, why are they giving them back? Tell the story, because even that in and of it is saying something. It's almost like admitting the truth without admitting the truth, or, you know, looking at the processes and the structures and the systems within the museum. You know, are people who work there being treated equitably and fairly, at such a basic level as that? And then the other thing is, so many museums, or museums here in London at least, are sponsored by oil companies. And we think about, you know, climate change and disasters happening, for example, the hurricane that just swept Jamaica, caused by climate change. And when a museum is being sponsored by an oil company that's causing that damage, you know, where then, what are we then saying about colonization and its ongoing impacts on, you know, people around the world? And I think, you know, we really have to look at what decolonization means, and what it means in a real sense. Like we've all been watching what's happening in Gaza for the past 2 years on our phones, and, you know, how can we divorce that from this conversation as well? So thinking about museums and how they see themselves as, like, you know, the keepers of history, or looking after or preserving objects, preserving history, when in fact, yes, they have the objects, but perhaps the objects are preserving the myth of the museum, and, you know, this establishment, this structure that sees itself as above everyone and everything else.
That's one of the arguments, isn't it, that some of the museums put forward, that they are guarding what is a global culture and they're taking good care of it and they're displaying it well. We're going to get more into that a little later. Kotoz, I want to ask you, you mentioned, you both alluded to that a little earlier, about the story of how the artifact got in that glass box into the museum, which is often absent, isn't it, in the descriptions. How important is that story?
Well, it is literally the story. You can very much talk for as long as you want about how beautiful the object is and go on pages and pages in catalogs describing its material and the kind of craftsmanship that went into it. But in a sense, what you're telling here is rather an orphan story. Where does that object come from, and what is its cultural significance within the context where it came from, as well as the context that it lives in today, is really the story. And it's always fascinating to me when you go to any of the major European museums, think of the Louvre, for example, that we're seeing on the screen right now, or the British Museum, about how this narration differs greatly from the halls where, for example, Renaissance paintings are presented, or the halls where royal jewels are presented, as in the case of the Louvre or in the Tower of London, and you compare that with the display of objects of Egyptological origin or ancient Egyptian objects or Persian objects and non-European objects in general, we tend to see that the narrative is always about how magnificent this piece of art is, and that's it. When you dare to ask a question of, okay, first of all, how was it created? Where was it created? How did it end up here? It's something that you never see on those really small text that you see next to the object, right? And in addition to that, we see a lot of, how can one put it? In a sense, self-delusion that is often the case in the halls of Western museums when it comes to rejecting any kind of explanation or even traditional narratives regarding some of these objects from the context of origin, simply by saying that we cannot trust the objectivity of these objects, of these narratives, and eventually we will not be able to include that in here. This is what these people who have made this object think about it, but we really need to be more critical about that and think about it from an entirely different perspective that eventually leads us to saying that we know less than we think we do.
Absolutely. The French art historian Didier Rickner gave this rather controversial opinion on France 24 when asked about giving artifacts back to their original countries.
In the 19th century, in the 18th century, in the 17th century, during all the wars, art was stolen. So we must give back everything or nothing. And more of this, these works of art, when they were taken, if they were not taken, they would have disappeared, because many of artifacts, African artifacts, are made of wood, and wood it was not made to be kept, you know, so it would have disappeared. They became works of art in museums because Europeans said it's art.
Shaheen, your reaction to that? Kotoz, I saw you cracking up there. I'm going to go to you just after.
It's just so patronizing, isn't it? And like a really, really silly excuse, like, oh, we made it art, so therefore it's art. We get to decide what art is, you know? It's this sort of very, yeah. And the fact that, you know, we get to decide what objectivity is. We get to define, you know, what these words mean. And it just reminds me of one of my favorite quotes, which is by the writer Toni Morrison, who said, definitions belong to the definers and not the defined, which I just feel is just so apt whenever we talk about, you know, heritage and museums and colonialism. And it's just really funny he says that, because another, actually one of the directors of a large London museum once said that to decolonize is to decontextualize, which I found hilarious, actually, because to take something from another place and put it in a glass box in a museum is actually to decontextualize. And you're, as Dr. Ahmed said, like, you're not telling the whole story. And that's even more interesting when you look at the curriculum here in the UK, the school curriculum. We don't learn about colonialism. We don't even learn about Northern Ireland, let alone what the British did in India and in Africa and, you know, other parts of the world. So to hear that sort of opinion now in 2025, you kind of ask yourself, how much has changed, and has anything really changed in the past few hundred years?
It's a very good question. Kotoz, your reaction to that. And I want to just off the back of that follow up with what are if you can sort of give it a synopsis of the main arguments being used not to give the artifacts back to where they belong.
So I think the short clip we just seen really captures a lot of these arguments in a sense. You can notice two very interesting narratives here. There is, first of all, the savior narrative, the idea that if it wasn't for the European powers who have actually came and took these objects and identified them, defined them as art, they wouldn't have existed, right? So, which is a narrative that is very much consistent with the savior narrative that has been displayed and executed in colonial contexts all around the world, be that in India, be that in Egypt and Syria being rescued from the oppression of the Ottoman Empire, or be that even in the Americas much earlier when it was the rescue of the natives from the oppression of being native. So that's one thing. And on the other hand, it's also very interesting to see that Europeans make art while non-Europeans more or less make heritage. See the contrast here, right? In the sense that it is only an art once it has been identified and defined as such by European critics, by European conservators, by European curators, and whatever else that might have been produced, be that in Egypt or in Nigeria or in India, and did not qualify to the liking of the curator or of the archaeologist to be seen as art, would not qualify as such, right? So here it is very important to question, who are we to make such a value judgment when it is absolutely not accepted if you do the same thing in the art circles in Europe or in the Western world in general nowadays, right? It would be very problematic for someone to go into a museum, point out a painting on the wall, say a postmodernist painting, and say, that's not really an art, right? But somehow it seems to be fully fine to be done to the artistic production of other peoples.
Double standards still very much remain, don't they? Just going to segue that into one thing that had a lot of people talking online. It really is something out of a movie, a world-famous museum, a lift truck, 4 men, and in just under 10 minutes, some of France's most prized crown jewels gone. All of this done in broad daylight, as the Louvre had already opened its doors to visitors. Now, people's reactions to that heist were everywhere, and this girl's response is one that resonated with so many. Take a listen.
Robbing the Louvre is not a crime, and for as long as colonialism is not considered the crime against humanity that it was and is, I will not consider robbing a museum full of stolen artifacts from the global south via colonialism a crime. Matter of fact, I refuse to be gaslit into using the language of, oh, I know stealing is a crime. Is it? Because it's only a crime when certain people do it. Everything about Western institutions is built on theft. France is built on theft from the legacy of France-Afrique. Every 2 business seconds, Macron opens his mouth to tell formerly colonized people that they should be grateful to have been colonized by France. Grateful that France brought them advancement. Every time we talk about colonialism, a lot of you say things like, well, you should be glad the colonialists took your artifacts so that they can house them in the museums and take better care of them. So as far as I'm concerned, this was not a theft. It was an exchange. It was trade. Maybe the people who took the artifacts could take better care of them. I don't know. Doesn't seem like they were very safe if they could be taken from a highly armed museum. If you aren't speaking out against the theft of minerals in Congo, the theft of land in Palestine, the theft of gold in Sudan, do not speak about the theft of anything in the Louvre.
Shaheen, these artifacts being presented in glass polished boxes, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in the United States, how do people feel when this is part of their heritage, their culture, their forefathers? How do they feel when they see that displayed like that?
I mean, I think we could all answer this question, couldn't we? It's a real mixture. So yes, you get to see something that is part of your heritage. It's behind glass and it's, under supposed security. So you can't actually get that close to it. However, seeing the object, knowing a bit about its history with the establishment sort of, purposefully not including that history is almost like another violence in and of itself. We know these objects are stolen. We know they came through colonialism. We know that there were, immense violence and trauma was involved, which plays out intergenerationally today. And we see those impacts today as well. So it's a lot, really. It's a lot. On one hand, you are seeing something incredibly beautiful that may have even sacred meaning. which again is kind of ripped out of it when it's in a glass box. And on the other hand, you know that story that is being, again, purposefully ignored. So it's a real mixture of things, I think.
Kotoz, we've just had the Grand Egyptian Museum opening in Egypt. I read something, I'm not sure if it's accurate, you'll probably know, that the pyramids were built over 25 years and this museum was built over 21 years. But I'm not sure if that's true, but I did read it and I thought it was interesting. But how significant is this? Is this just another museum or is this something else?
It's actually very significant, and that doesn't necessarily mean, or it's not necessarily the case because of the scale of the museum, which is enormous, or the amount of effort and problematic funding even that went into it, but rather because it really kind of redefines or reinvents Egyptology under a completely new light. One should not look at the new Grand Egyptian Museum without looking at the old Egyptian Museum in the downtown area, because both of these buildings, along with the entirety of the enterprise behind them, mark two completely different stages in the history of Egyptology, with the old Egyptian Museum being a product of colonial Egyptology as it emerged really from the height of the colonial period in the 19th century and the early 20th century. One thing that is often missed by visitors of the old Egyptian Museum is as soon as you enter through the courtyard of the museum, you'll find to your right some kind of a pantheon where more or less the godfathers of the very discipline of Egyptology have their busts all around, surrounding the sarcophagus of Auguste Mariette, who's considered to be the godfather of French Egyptology in Egypt, right? And in this collection, you never really see a single Egyptian face. You see a bunch of Germans and a bunch of French people in there. And I understand why that is the case, because Egyptology was born since the very beginning as a European endeavor. However, as we do more and more research into the history of such disciplines, of such research as Egyptology, we discover the hidden narratives of tens of scholars and tens of activists and tens of bureaucrats who have been working and promoting the idea of Egyptology for Egyptians and by Egyptians since the very start.
Shaheen, are we going to see Nefertiti's bust, the Rosetta Stone, the Elgin marbles returned?
It's sad to say, but probably not. People have been campaigning for items to be returned for years and years, and there always seem to be sort of red tape around that. So, however, some universities are giving objects back that they have. But then also, I think it has to be signed off at the highest point in government as well. So unless the laws change, I don't see it, unfortunately, happening anytime soon, unless there are some more heists. I don't know.
Very briefly, Kotoz, do you think that returning artifacts will repair the wounds of history?
Will it repair some wounds? Yes. Will it repair the entire experience and trauma of coloniality? Absolutely not. It is actually fixing the narrative that's going to have this effect.
Okay, and very briefly from both of you, final question. Kotoz, do you have a favorite museum?
Very good question. I think I would say the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam is my favorite, but maybe after a couple of visits to the new Grand Egyptian Museum, it will become that.
Shaheen, same question to you.
I think for the objects, it's the V&A here in London, but the narrative is the District 6 Museum in Cape Town in South Africa.
Well, it's been a wonderful conversation, such an important one. Kotoz and Shaheen, thank you very much for joining us on the stream. And thank you for being part of the conversation. And I'll see you soon.